To begin my sermon this morning, I'd like to start with something called a territory acknowledgement. The land that the church sits on currently was the traditional territory of the Erie people. There's actually an internet map that you can use, and you can find out, using any address, the traditional tribal native people who once lived on that land and may still be in and around that area. When I looked up our home address in Ohio City, it said Erie and Mississauga. This is a very important and helpful way to name those who once lived on the land, to name the problem of colonialism and the sins of the past, to work towards reconciliation of the future. But it's especially important, I think, to recognize that on this Land Sunday, as we continue in the season of creation. As I mentioned in my children's sermon, Native American peoples believe that the land itself is a sacred being. It is spiritual. And because of this, the land evokes in Native people what one Native writer describes as extremely powerful feelings of gratitude and indebtedness, obliging us to behave toward the land as if we are related to it. And isn't that a wonderful image? To think about the land as our relation, as perhaps even our extended family. And it makes me wonder how we might treat the land differently, and all of creation for that matter, if we thought about it as a member of our extended family, or even as an extension of our very own selves. There's another Native writer who writes about this, and she says, "We are the land. The land is not really a place that separates ourselves or separated from ourselves where we act out the dramas of our own lives. The land is rather a part of our own being. It is our very self." Believe it or not, this idea that the land is our very being is actually communicated to us through our Judeo-Christian creation story. There are two creation stories in Genesis, and we heard the second one last week in worship from Genesis 2. We hear that God scoops up the soil of the earth, in Hebrew the Adamah, and God uses this soil, this living earth, to shape and create the first human being, man. But our Hebrew siblings know that there's some special wordplay in the Hebrew language that is happening here, because the soil is the Adamah, and the Hebrew name for man is Adam, which is where we get that proper name Adam from the Adam and Eve story. So God uses the Adamah to shape the Adam. And this highlights for us the connection of how our very being, the identity of who we are, is literally connected to the soil, to the land of the earth. It's kind of like if you were to adopt a dog and you named it Dog. That would mean that the name represents that creature's very identity. And the same is true for us. So it is with our identity as earth creatures. We are made from the living earth, and we are living earth creatures. Now, for my scientists out there, and I'm eyeballing my husband, this is true in the scientific world too. There are chemicals and organic materials that make up every single organic living thing. The same stuff that makes up each of us is the same stuff that makes up the stars and the trees and the soil, the very building blocks of life. Carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, the things that make up nutrient-rich Adamah, or soil. In this way, we are connected, we are unified with the universe around us, because we are made of the same stuff. We are created by the same Creator. We come from the earth, and to the earth we shall return. We are reminded of this every single Ash Wednesday at the beginning of Lent, when we are marked with the cross of Christ with ashes on our forehead. The words are said to us, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Another way of translating that is, remember that you are made from the living earth, and to the living earth you shall return. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, Adema to Adema, living earth to living earth. This is the circle of life. And in a marvelous, mysterious way, God has designed life so that nothing, not one particle, is wasted. For we know that when a creature dies, when there is death and decay, those nutrients return to the earth to help foster new life. This is why compost does such a good job growing things. It's life springing forth from death. Indeed, Jesus models this miraculous life, death, life process for us too. He too modeled this journey, returning to the earth, to the land, to the Adema, when he was buried in the tomb for 3 days in the heart of the earth, and then rose again on the third day, bringing new life, new promises, new possibilities. With Christ's resurrection, Christ destroys the power of death and decay, turning it instead into something that brings us closer to God and produces new life. Somehow, some way, even if it is not like the way it was before, even if it is something entirely different. I can't help but think then of the millions of acres of land in California and the Pacific Northwest that are groaning in death and destruction under these historic wildfires. I look at the pictures, I read the stories, and it makes my stomach turn. There is so much death, there is so much grief, there is so much destruction, heartache. I look at those pictures and I know that that death and that loss and that pain are real, just like the death and loss and pain of Good Friday was real. And God sees it, and God's heart aches with that pain and death and destruction. And even so, our story is a resurrection story. God promises that there will be new birth and new life on the other side of sorrow. God promises that death will not have the last word. God promises that there is life after death, and healing after destruction, and hope after sorrow. God promises that the land will again flourish. And this promise of resurrection is crafted into the way that God made creation itself. Do you know that there is a species of pine cone out there in the West that has such tightly sealed seeds in its frame that those seeds will only be released in the setting of high temperatures, the kind of high temperatures that come along with wildfires? These pine trees are famous for populating post-fire landscapes because their seeds love the nutrient-rich soil that fires leave behind. So much so that their seedlings sprout new life almost immediately after a fire goes through an area. This is not to minimize the devastating effects of those fires on the West Coast. These fires have affected creatures and lands and people, and it's not to minimize that. But it is to say that God promises somehow, some way, that there is life after death, and healing after destruction, and hope after sorrow. Today in our reading that we heard from Christy, Psalm 139 reminds us that there is nowhere we can go, good or bad, land or sea, heaven or earth, where God's presence is not already there. God is already at work, already transforming that which is dead into new life. For us, for the land, for all of creation. Amen.